All right, now onto the interesting stuff. Welcome to the Editing Fundamentals module. In this module, we're going to be discovering every single one of Lightroom's editing tools. We're going to be dissecting how it works from a fundamental level, why you would be wanting to use one tool over another, and what are the smarts that go on behind the scenes that Lightroom does for us. Because there are a lot. A lot of the times we see labels and we see sliders and we see the effects that these sliders have, and we take for granted what is actually going on behind the scenes, because for a lot of the developed module features and tools, Lightroom does do a lot of complex and intelligent things for us without us even noticing. So that's what this module is all about. The goal of this module is to deeply understand every single one of Lightroom's editing tools so that we can arm ourselves with the combination of these tools later on when we move into the workflow and end-to-end editing sessions. By the end of the module, you'll know exactly what every single one of these tools does at a deep level, and you'll know exactly why you would use one versus the other and when to use it. All right, before we start editing our photos, let's go over all of the UI so that we understand where everything is and what everything does, and get a lay of the land before we start really diving into the editing tools. All right, so we're in the develop module and it looks very similar to the library module. On the left, we have the navigator, which we had from the library module as well. Underneath the navigator pane, we have the presets pane, which houses all of the presets that you could possibly be using. It creates new presets, exports presets, and etc. We'll be covering this in great detail in the building a visual aesthetic module. For now, we will just close it because we won't be using it for now. Snapshots are a great way to store versions of your edits if you want to save your edits at a point in time and then keep working and maybe come back to it or something like that. Having snapshots and creating new snapshots is a great way to do that. The history tab will show us the history of edits that we've made over time. And if we haven't made any, then none will show up here, or we could even choose to clear them. In this instance, I chose to clear them just to save the clutter, the visual clutter on the UI. And then at the bottom, we have collections, which is the same as what was in the library pane as well. And we can see my one image for this particular lesson and for this example. For now, we will close it just so that we can clear up the UI a little bit more. So the copy and paste buttons down here copy the edits and the choices that you've made on your grade and your edit, and then you can paste them onto subsequent images if you wish. Down here at the bottom, we have the same film strip from the library. And then across the middle section here, it is mostly the same, except in this instance, we'll just be working with the one image and it would be a Lupe view. Over here, we have some information about the image, the metadata that was attached to this particular image. We can press the I key on the keyboard to either make it go away or give us some different information depending on what we are trying to go for. For this example, I'll leave it on the shooting settings that it was shot at. Down here, we have views that are useful for comparing two images against each other, or we can even compare the before and after of our edit. Right next to it, we have soft proofing, which is a great way to preview your image so that you get it ready for print. This is a print feature, so we won't be covering it that much in this particular course. To show and hide this particular toolbar, we can just press T to get rid of it, or to bring it back. For the sake of clarity for this UI, we'll get rid of it for this example. Now on the right is where we will be spending the majority of our time. So again, we have the histogram, which is exactly the same as the library histogram. Then we have the local adjustments here, and then all of the individual editing panes and modules. And there's quite a few of them. The two buttons down here, previous, will copy our previous settings if we had any. In this case, we don't. and reset will reset the entire image and redo all of these adjustments like it will right now. We can always press Command or Alt Z, and that will undo our last action. So in this case, it undid our reset. We can also change the background color of the image by right-clicking on the background here and then changing the color to whatever we so desire. And as is the case with the library module, we're able to collapse these panels if we don't need them, just to save space. And we'll be definitely doing so in the examples to come. Again, we can press Shift and Tab to remove all of them or to show all of them again. And this becomes even more useful if you're dealing with multiple monitor sizes or different resolutions. All right, let's start with the histogram, the very top thing on the right-hand side of the develop module here. So the histogram is how color and tonality are rendered in your photos, and this is represented on a chart of sorts. And tone, by the way, or tonality, is just a different word for brightness, and you will hear that word quite a lot when it comes to photography. Now, with the histogram, this is the most accurate representation of what's going on in your image. This is much better than trusting your eye, and especially since you may be looking at different versions of this image on different monitors, on different devices, and so on. Every single digital camera you own will have a histogram that comes along with it, so it's a good idea to master what this tool does. Now, on the horizontal axis here, going from left to right, we have 5 tones: blacks, shadows, midtones or exposure, highlights, and whites. Now on the vertical axis, we have the intensity of those values across their particular given channels. So the gray chart here is your tonal value, and then all of the colors are the representations of what's going on in those channels. If we hover off the histogram, we can see the settings that this particular image was shot at. And if we hover over the image, we can see exactly what mix of red, green, and blue belong to that portion of the bit that we are hovering over. And then down here we have original photo, which refers to the preview. And original photo here, we have a very quick preview when it's zooming in and out. No lag at all. Now, when it comes to the histogram and using it in Lightroom, one thing that you can do, although it's not very common, is to actually slide these values around. And as you can see, what this does is it moves the corresponding basic tone slider down here. And if we grab these regions up and down, it'll obviously grab the corresponding region that goes along with it as well. One thing that is really important to note here is the idea of clipping. So one thing that the histogram is fantastic at doing, if we just reset this here, is letting you know whether or not there is missing information in your image. So what do I mean by that? See, this thing here and this thing here are your clipping indicators, is what it is called. Basically, when you have this selected, as you can see notified by this white box, if we drag these values really high as they will go, we can see that the image starts to get this really red effect. And this is Lightroom telling us, hey, there is no more information in this highlighted area and you need to do something about it. This is what's referred to as a clipped portion of the image. The obvious solution here is to then drag these down so that we can get rid of the red and so that we have this color information. But the histogram is great for us to be able to just see at a glance, okay, is this portion overflowing the very edge of the histogram, or is it more receded like this and well within the range of what is available in the histogram? Of course, this happens on the other side as well. If we click the shadow clipping and we go all the way to the bottom, instead of red, we get blue this time, and we can see that the dark portions of the city are now way clipped and don't have any information on them. While these clipping indicators are on, if we press the letter J on our keyboard, we can get rid of the preview and we can see the image as it is. So for example, if I was to drag this way back up there with our red clipped whites, we can now see that there's both red and blue clipped portions of the image, and that's what it looks like. We can see that there is no other color information in this white area, and especially in these areas here, there is just no information. It's just all black. Quick reset there. Now with the histogram, typically most people, myself included, want to start the image with a histogram that is well within the bounds of these two sides, so that you have the most amount of information in the image to start with. From there, then you will be able to make your adjustments and know that there is the maximum amount of information while you're editing the photo. A lot of that will make a lot more sense once we dive into the workflow sections and go bit by bit as to how to edit the photo properly. But for now, a chart that looks like this is something that you want to be aiming for when you are shooting your photographs. Okay, let's get into the first set of sliders in the develop module. And we'll start here in the basic panel. And the first set of sliders we'll be using is the basic tone sliders. So these 6 sliders here. It's worth noting at this point that all 6 of these sliders are what's referred to as global adjustments. That is, they affect the entire image whenever you're using any one of these settings. This is in stark contrast to local adjustments, which only affect certain portions of the image that you need to affect. This idea of global versus local adjustments is an idea that I'll be constantly repeating throughout this course. And let's go in order of appearance as to what each one of these different sliders do. So when it comes to exposure, this first one, the exposure actually controls what's referred to as mid-tone brightness, or what the general darkness or brightness of your image is. As we can see here over on the histogram, when we hover over this middle section, it actually controls somewhere between around the 40 to the 70% of the range. And we can see when we hold on to the mid-tone selection, we're also affecting the exposure slider at the very same time. So while you might think of exposure as the entire image, it actually is just the middle portion of the image, or the mid-tone brightness. Also, for dynamic range reasons, it's usually much better to get this exposure setting correct in camera first, then editing it in Lightroom, rather than having to compensate for the exposure in Lightroom. The next slider here is the contrast slider, and the contrast slider controls mid-tone contrast specifically. It's saying anywhere in this mid-tone up here in the histogram, control this particular range of exposure by either squishing it together to create less contrast, or by spreading it apart to create more contrast. And just to accentuate the example even more, we can see the midtones get stretched, we can see the midtones get contracted. This contrast control is a powerful way to control mid-tone contrast specifically, but in my opinion is not the most optimal way to control overall global contrast on your image, and we'll go more into detail on that with the tone curve. Now, with these 4 sliders, the highlight and the shadows sliders should be thought of as a pair. You should be using these two together at all times whenever you're trying to control the basic tone, or at least thinking of them in pairs. And then the white and the blacks should also be thought of as in pairs. The reason for this is that these two, the highlights and the shadows, are generally used for either preserving detail or accentuating detail. So what I mean by that is, for the highlights or the shadows, what you want to do is check the histogram and see if you've got enough information in your image for you to be able to edit from. So in this case there is, because the exposure is quite flat. But if, say for example, this portion of the image had shadow detail that was not visible to the naked eye, then we could actually raise the shadows so that we could see what was in there, and then we can edit that later on. Conversely, the same is true also with the highlight portions. If there was not enough detail here in the clouds, then what we could do is we could bring down this highlight slider so that we could see a little bit more and so that we know what we're working with from a detail perspective. Now the highlight controls roughly the 70 to 90% top end of the histogram, while the shadows controls roughly the 10 to 30% of the histogram. To go along with the highlights and shadows, the next two, the whites and the blacks, again should be thought of as together. The whites control the 90 to 100% of the histogram, and the blacks control the 0 to 10% of the histogram. Both of these sliders should be thought of as how white do you want the brightest parts of your images to be, or how black do you want your darkest portions of your image to be. So usually this can be used as a contrast tool. So we can actually say, okay, of the highlighted portions, we want those to be really bright like this. And of the shadow portions, we want them to be really black like this. And as we can see on the histogram is now quite stretched out from left to right. But at the same time, we also have values at the very, very ends of the scales, which shows us that we potentially may have clipping issues. Which if we press the clipping indicator here, we definitely do have that. And over here, we definitely do have the red over there. Now, a quick shortcut that we can use here if we want to reset our values is double clicking on any single one of these labels will reset the value for that slider, like so. Or if we want to reset all of them at once, we can double click the tone label here. Also, Adobe has a auto feature to which it will automatically adjust the exposure to what it thinks is the optimal amount of exposure, like so. Sometimes it doesn't always get everything right, but in this case, it's actually not too bad. All of these options are your most powerful tools you have to control your overall image's basic tonal structure. Sometimes they can be used for contrast, and if you want to use them for that, there's no right or wrong answer here. But in my opinion, a much better tool for controlling contrast is the tone curve, which we will cover in a later lesson. These tools, the basic tone tools, in my opinion, are the best tools you have for what I call resetting the image, which is getting the image ready for the rest of the edit. All right, so next up we have presence. Now, presence is where things can start getting a little bit confusing and a little bit technical, and I don't really agree with the presence controls being this high up in the overall stack of editing tools from a understanding perspective. So there's a lot of technical jargon in this particular lesson. And so if you are new to Lightroom and this information seems a little bit too much and your eyes start to glaze over, then feel free to skip to the next lessons, do those first, and then come back to this one later. Okay, so there are three presence controls here: texture, clarity, and dehaze. Now the first one, texture, is a relatively new control, and it's used for controlling, well, the texture of details in your image. So in order to not make it sound like a simple explanation, this is where it gets a little bit technical. So an image can be broken up into frequencies. Just like we have red, green, and blue in terms of frequencies or channels, we can also have high frequency details, mid frequency features, and low frequency areas. Now, if you're used to the word sharpening, so we have a specific sharpening tool down here, well, you already kind of know what this idea is. So sharpening affects the fine edges and the fine details of an image, which is what we can see here. Whereas texture, the control we are going to be using in this lesson, controls the medium-sized features of an image. All right, so this is a portrait of one of my friends, Miyu, and we will use her as an example for the texture control. So although she has really, really nice skin, we will zoom in on her face here and see what is going on in this image. Now, if we slide the texture slider to the left, it's saying, hey, for the medium-sized features of the image at a global level, decrease the fineness of those medium-sized features. So if we look at her pores while we're sliding this across, we can see that her pores are actually disappearing as we slide the texture slider to the left. But at the same time, the fine details, like the fine details on her hair, for example, are still intact. because it is the medium-sized details that are getting affected here. So if we reset that, all of these larger pores and larger size pixels are the medium-sized details. However, if we go too far with this texture, we suddenly see that everything is still quite glowy, but we still have all the fine features of her hair and, you know, the lashes on her eyes, for example, that are still present in the image. Conversely, if we zoom in on her coat here and we want to enhance the medium features of the image, so we can do that by sliding things to the right, and we can see that the medium-sized details on the coat are getting more defined, and even more so when we go all the way. We can also see though that all of the medium-sized details on her face have also been accentuated as well, and that definitely doesn't look flattering, so we don't want to do that. One thing to note is that the texture slider, regardless of whether we use it negatively or we use it positively, it's generally a subtle change. However, the same is not true of the clarity slider. So the clarity slider is a much harder change and a much more pronounced change than the texture slider. The clarity slider actually controls the contrast of the midtones. So if you remember again, the contrast slider up here affects the midtone portions only. The exposure slider here affects the midtones as well. Now, as we use the slider either negatively or positively, we can see here on the histogram that the shadows, the blacks, the highlights, and the white portions of the images aren't that affected by the clarity slider. Again, it is mostly the midtones that get affected by this slider. What happens with the clarity slider is that it takes the midtones, and of the midtones, it says whatever is the darker parts of the midtones and whatever is the brighter parts of the midtones, make the contrast between those two areas more pronounced or less pronounced, depending on whether you slide it left or right. So if we zoom in on Miyu's hair here, we can see that if we slide the clarity slider to the right, it increases the contrast in her hair, which also inherently has a byproduct of increasing the overall perceived sharpness of the overall image. But that's because the human eye perceives sharpness as stark contrast. Contrast or high contrast areas are what makes things look sharp. And the sharper the contrast between two areas, especially between two pixels, the sharper the overall area will look. So if we zoom out here and we slide the clarity slider to the left to get minus clarity, what we can see here is that the image actually starts to become a little bit glowy. And it's becoming glowy because the contrast is being reduced. The brightness and the darkness between adjacent pixels are being spread apart further, and this lack of contrast or this reduced amount of contrast is what causes the glowy effect to occur. Really interesting stuff, right? But very technical as well, so I apologize if things are glossing over for you right now as it is, but it's important to know that the texture, clarity, and sharpness controls are all different things that have different purposes. And later on in the workflow module, we will get more in depth with how to use all three of these things together to create the look that we're looking for. All right, let's get on to the last and third control for the present panel, and that's called dehaze. Here we have an image of the Sydney Harbour Bridge under fog, and the dehaze tool is perfect for the illustration of this image. Now, the dehaze tool is one of Lightroom's intelligent tools. It is a tool that Lightroom has specifically created for the purpose of dehazing an image or defogging an image. And with that, there's a bunch of smarts that it does for us that are different to other tools in the overall stack of controls. Sliding the dehaze slider to the right, Lightroom intelligently determines what portions of the image are the hazy parts and brings the contrast up of those parts whilst retaining everything else that is supposed to be detail. And this is really interesting because we can't actually achieve this result if we, say, use the contrast slider, for example. The same is true if we push the highlight slider down or even the shadow slider up or down as well. None of these options will give us the same effect that the dehaze slider does. That is, again, because it is intelligent. Adobe says that it tries to estimate the light that is lost due to scattering through the atmosphere with hazy conditions. So it is a tool that is very specialized in this way. Now, of course, there are side effects of going too hard on the dehaze slider. As we can see here, what is being created is color noise. Also, there seems to be quite a halo around the darker portions of this image, which is a very common side effect of too much dehaze. One common thing we'll actually see as well is that because the bright portions of the image become lowered so much when we use the dehaze slider too much, we can actually see if there's any imperfections on our sensor, as we do have right here. Alternatively, if we go the other way on the dehaze slider, it adds more haze to the overall image. And again, this is not the same as adding more exposure, which pushes the histogram all the way to the right till we just get eventually a white image. And it is not the same as the highlight slider going all the way to the right, or the white slider going all the way to the right as well. Again, it is the reverse of the estimation of the light that is lost when fog or haze goes through the air. Okay, so the tone curve, a commonly misunderstood tool, and rightly so, because it is one of Lightroom's most powerful but most complex tools, just due to how precise you can be with the changes that you can make here. Think of the tone curve as a precision knife, either for adjusting contrast or for adjusting color. Over here on the top, we have 5 different options for the tone curve. The first 2, the parametric curve and the point curve, are both options that are great for controlling contrast. The latter 3, the RGB channels, are tools that are great for color grading. What you'll see here is a basic 45-degree line from left to right. And as we scroll and hover over the line, we can see that we have shadows being affected here. We have darks being affected here, lights here, and highlights here. Similar to how when we hover over the histogram up top here, we have blacks, shadows, exposure, highlight, and whites. They're both kind of similar, but they're not exactly the same. What you'll notice is that when we click and hold on a region, we're able to affect that particular region. So it's very simple. We just grab, make an anchor, and then up and down for that particular region. Super easy. However, what you'll notice is that behind this 45-degree line, there's actually a chart. And this chart is the histogram that looks very similar to this, but just squashed in. And this is where things start to get a little bit complicated, because there is a very common misconception out there that the tone curve and the basic tone up here are the same thing, but they are not. You see, what happens is when we make changes here in the tone curve, so let's say we drag this up, in real time we can see the global histogram, because that's what it is. This histogram represents a real-time view of what's happening in the image as we do it. So when we drag up and down here, we can see the histogram moving in real time. However, you'll notice that the histogram behind the tone curve doesn't change as we make adjustments to the tone curve. Why is this so? Well, the histogram behind the tone curve, think of it like a snapshot of what your basic tone looks like. So say, for example, if I move the highlight down here, you can see, of course, the histogram changes at the same time. But as soon as I let go, the actual histogram behind the tone curve changes as well. And this is the case with all of the basic tone adjustments. Basically, what's happening here is that the tone curve is snapshotting the image before the contrast adjustments are made. So if we reset all of the curves that we made here, we can see that the histogram behind the tone curve didn't change. So what it's effectively saying is it's taking your basic exposure adjustments, freezing them, and then you can make adjustments in contrast after the fact. So as I mentioned in the basic tone lesson, these settings here are great for resetting our image into a point where we can edit them with as much detail as possible. And then the tone curve excels at controlling the contrast of what's available in the image. So basic tone first as the foundation, and then the tone curve next as our contrast. Now, a couple of cool things about the parametric curve. We can actually change the splits of the curve. So we can define what regions are shadows, what regions are darks, what regions are lights, and what regions are highlights, simply by just dragging these anchors across, like so. So say, for example, if we wanted our light changes to affect more of the image, this kind of split would make it work in that way. So as we can see, it affects the majority of the line as it's coming up and down. Whereas if we move this anchor down here, if we go up and down in the shadows, we can see that barely any of it is moving. Where if we move the anchor out a little bit more and define more shadows in this histogram, then we can see that the line and the anchor that we give it affects more of the image. Alternatively, we can just adjust the regions via sliders here, and that's perfectly valid as well, like so. Oftentimes, you'll see a S-curve being made as a contrast curve. This is the kind of typical curve that you'll be using the most often, because this is the kind of curve that creates the most amount of contrast. Whether you use the graph here and slide the anchors up and down, or you use the slider and slide left to right, whichever choice is up to you. There's no right or wrong answer here. Okay, let's reset all of this. The next option is the point curve. The point curve is where things start to get really precise. What we can do with the point curve is set our own points so that we can control our own contrast as finely as we would like. So a very common approach with this point curve is to actually make points like this and then create our own level of S-curve like this. The power here is that we can move these anchors left, right, up and down wherever we like. But this power, unfortunately, also comes at a cost. If, say, for example, we drag this too far down, we can see that the line here is actually bottoming out, and all of the shadow regions we can see are all just very hard black. This is also reflected in our histogram as well. And so we have to be careful with how we are treating the point curve because it can go a little bit sideways sometimes. This is even the case if we add additional points, and some of the points are either invalid or they shift the point curve in such a way that it degrades the image, like this. As we can see, all of this noise has started to appear. All of this color noise has also started to appear. We have no details in the shadows, and all of the shadows are black. So whilst this method is very powerful, definitely keep an eye on how far you go with this contrast adjustment. Typically, for me personally, I find a contrast curve that looks something like this to be the most ideal and typically what I gravitate towards. One cool thing you can do here is we can actually bring this last point up and bring this first point down. And what this does, as we can see on the histogram, is that it crunches the whites and crunches the blacks such that the blackest parts or the whitest parts of the image become clipped. And this is a common technique that is used in the film aesthetic where you have very faded blacks, it's called. This is how you actually achieve that look. And we can go even further if I delete this point and let's say I bring this down just a little bit. And I bring this last point up quite a lot. We can see that all of this region here is just a faded black. It's not even that black anymore. It's more like a mid-gray. But this is how to achieve that look. Down here in the point curve dropdown, we have two presets that Adobe has included for us. Medium contrast, which looks like this, which is a very just quick way to add points to the tone curve, or strong contrast, which is very similar. And we can use these as a base to just quickly get started if you can't be bothered to make your own points. From here, we have the RGB channels. Now, the RGB channels are mostly used for color grading, so adding color to the image. What you'll see here is that the behavior is quite the same. We can add anchor points into the line here, and we can say of the highlights, we can add red to them, or of the shadows we can add green to them, as we can see the green section and the red section here. What this effect does is it gives you a split toning kind of look, and this may or may not be what you're going for, but this is where the power of the tone curve when it comes to color grading lies. Now, the same is true with every single other channel as well. And this is a good time to point out that all of these changes are what's referred to as additive. They stack up on top of one another, like this. So now that I've made changes in both the blue and the red channels, I can make a quick adjustment to the green channel as well. But now that I've got adjustments on all three of these channels, I can actually go back to the parametric curve and add more contrast to the image on top of the changes that I've made to the RGB. The same is true with the point curve as well. As you can see, we've already got points here on the point curve. And even though we've added points on the parametric curve, we can continue to add points on the point curve as well. And they all add up on top of each other. Now, of course, this isn't what we would go for in an edit, but this is just an example of the kind of power that the tone curve has. So just to recap here, you either want to be thinking of the tone curve in one of two ways. You either want to be adjusting your contrast with the parametric curve or the point curve, or you want to be adjusting your color grading specifically with the RGB channel curves. For me personally, I don't actually use the RGB curves at all because I find it's a little bit too precise and it slows down my workflow just a little bit. So most of the time I'm actually using this point curve, and usually I'm using a contrast curve that looks something like that really quickly. And usually this is enough to get me started, at least for an idea of what I want to do with the contrast in the image. Let's talk color, because color is perhaps the most important part when it comes to editing an image. And for me personally, it's definitely where I spend the majority of my time. When I think about basic color, I'm thinking about three different options in Lightroom. I'm thinking about the white balance up here in the top, then the global saturation and vibrance options, then the what's referred to as the HSL, or the hue, saturation, and luminance. Let's start with the white balance. So white balance is basically your camera's way of calibrating what true white looks like, and that happens through a balance of temperature and tint. Temperature is either going to lean more towards the cooler side, so blue, or the warmer side, so yellow. Or the tint will lean more towards the green or the purple. Now at this point, I highly recommend that if you are not currently shooting in a RAW format in your camera, then I highly recommend that you do so, because the white balance adjustments in your camera are a great way to get color adjustments in a kind of free way. And when I say free, I mean without artifacts and without additives that you aren't looking for. And with raw images, you're able to change any of these values without degrading the image at all. So that's a huge win if you are using this particular format, and you can be really creative with how you use white balance. If you're shooting in JPEG, for example, you unfortunately don't get this luxury. Down here, we have the vibrance and saturation options, and both of these are different. So both of these options are global in that when we make changes to these options, they affect the entire image, but one is not like the other, where saturation is simply a control of the intensity of all of the colors in the image. As we can see here, this effect is quite predominantly yellow and orange right now. Vibrance, on the other hand, is intelligent. Lightroom takes what it thinks is the predominant colors in the image and tries to boost the intensity of those instead, rather than every single color in the image. And so what we can see here is that we've also increased the amount of balance that the colors have in this image versus a full saturation here. And this is especially prevalent in the blue of the pillars here, because that is definitely a dominant part of the image. Coming down to the HSL sliders, what we have is the hue, saturation, and luminance sliders. I generally love to leave it as all because I like having all of the options available to us. Alternatively, you can have it set to just color, in which you are specifically selecting a color to modify and then modifying the HSL based on that color. For this example though, we will leave this as HSL, as this is the recommended view that I recommend you use. Now, hue is essentially the selection of color in the range of colors that it is currently belonging to. And it's quite straightforward. For example, if we take the color orange, it will take the color orange slider here and drag it into more of a yellow, thus changing all of the orange portions of the image into yellow. And you will notice here that this is a somewhat semi-local control in that it's only affecting the orange portions of the image. It's not affecting any of the other colors within it. One thing to notice here is that these changes are not additive. So for example, if I was to move the aqua to blue and then move that blue then to purple, it's not like all of these purple areas are suddenly going to change into magenta now. The blue still remains in the blue channel, the aqua still remains in the aqua channel. It's just that the declaration of what that color is has changed. This is in contrast to calibration, which is this tool down here at the bottom, which we will cover in a later lesson. Okay, so the next example is saturation, and this one is probably the most easy to understand. You've probably seen saturation before and probably used it before as well. Saturation simply refers to the intensity of a color. So whether a color is more intense like this, or a color is less intense like this. It simply takes the color that is in that relevant channel and increases it or decreases it. Luminance is where things get a little bit interesting. Luminance refers to the brightness of a color. Sliding a color to the right will actually add white to the color, which makes the color more bright. However, at the same time, it also reduces the intensity of that color. And so you may find that you need to offset that by adding more saturation back into that color as well. Conversely, if you slide the slider to the left, it adds more black to the color, which makes the color more rich up until a certain point. So that we can see here, it does become quite dark, even to the point where it's actually artifacting and creating these unwanted color artifacts. One thing I would also point out right now is that the luminance slider is not a replacement for the highlight slider up here in the basic tone panel. You should not be using luminance for highlight recovery. It's not meant for that. And just in terms of some shortcuts, again, if we make a bunch of these changes, we can not only reset them by double clicking the anchor or double clicking the label like so. We can also reset the whole block by double clicking the label up here. We can also use the picker to directly control over the image exactly where we want to affect. So we will take this blue color and we will slide it up and down. And the advantage of doing this is that if the color you've selected has multiple hues or multiple values in different channels, then Lightroom will also affect the ratio of what was in your selection at the same time as well. So as you can see here, what I'm doing with moving this particular pixel up and down is that the mix of aqua to blue is actually different. The place that I selected has actually different values of blue and aqua in the same pixel. And so Lightroom is giving us the ratios based on that. This can become really useful and speed up your workflow if you are unsure about the changes that you're trying to make. Now, it's perfectly common to switch between HSL, the vibrance and saturation, and your white balance options back and forth as you go along within your edit. You will also find that as you increase contrast, your saturation also increases at a global level as well. So that is something to be aware of. If an image in general doesn't have a lot of contrast, then before doing your color changes, I would recommend doing your contrast changes. Ideally, from a workflow perspective, which we will be covering in the workflow modules later on, this is the general approach that I recommend. Color grading is a relatively new control that was previously called split toning in Lightroom. Compared to that, this new color grading tool is vastly more powerful to use and is vastly easier to abuse, but we'll cover more about its artful usage later on. The color grading panel in general, the main objective of why you would use this panel is to add a color tint to your images. It mostly revolves around this three-way color wheel. This one is for the midtones, this is for shadows, and this is for highlights. Across the top of the panel here, we have the different views for all of these options. We have what we're on right now, which is the three-way color control. We can then individually access each of these different color wheels. And then we can also access a global color wheel, which we will cover last, because that one has a little bit of a special consideration to it. Most of your time, however, will be spent using this three-way wheel. By default, it looks like this. Thing with this is that the center of the wheel controls both your hue and your saturation. The way you use it is that you drag the center circle to the color that you are looking for. Let's say it's this one. And then from there, the range between the very center of the circle to the very edge of the circle here is how much saturation is going to be controlled in that particular range. So remember how I said it was really easy to abuse? If we say, for example, have something like this, we can see that our image becomes very stylized very quickly. And that may or may not be what we are looking for. So oftentimes a lower saturation value by doing this is more desirable. If, say, for example, we like the saturation that we are currently at, but we want to change the hue, we just drag this outer circle here around to the desired color, like so. And as you can see, the vibe and the general color tint is very different from, let's say, this colored blue to this colored orange. The color grading tool is a way to stylize your images quite significantly. In addition to the circle here, we have this control, which controls the luminosity. So coming back to our HSL lesson, luminosity is the brightness of color. And so of that color, we are saying it is adding white or it is adding black to make it darker. Okay, so let's get an example rolling. So let's use some warm midtones. We'll have some very cool shadows and we will have some very pink highlights. Typically not a style that I would go for personally, but we'll just use this for the example. Blending down here, if it's stuck at 50%, the default, that means it's going to equally blend all three of these colors together. You can think of it as similar to feather, how smoothly the blend goes. And so in this instance, 50 is in the middle. If I go all the way to the end, all of the colors start to just mesh into one another. And then if I go the other way, you'll see that the regions are quite defined. So this highlight area is strictly this purpley pink color. All of the shadow area is strictly this blue color. And all these midtones right here are this orange color. The balance slider here is very similar to how the split toning feature used to work. So if you leave it in the middle, it will actually favor midtones predominantly. And then if you slide it over to the left, it'll favor more shadows. As you can see with what happens here, the shadows are currently blue and the majority of the image went blue. Conversely, if we slide it to the other side, it should go more purple and pink as it did here. For now, we'll just leave it in the middle. Now with all of these options, we can see that because we've got current selections for each one, these three options here all have dots underneath them to say that each one of these regions has a selection. If we say, for example, right click and we go reset midtones, this dot will no longer appear. If we go into the selection, we can kind of fine tune everything a little bit more. Instead of using the wheel as our selection, we can actually go back and start using sliders again, which is quite nice. I personally prefer the slider version as it gives me more control, but your personal preference is totally up to you. One thing we can do here on the left is if we click this, we can actually add custom colors to our palette, and we can start to create a palette of colors that we can replicate throughout all of our images. If we want to, say, for example, use the dropper, we can hold onto it, and simply just drop over the location that we wish to pick the color from, and there we have it. If we want to, let's say, select this swatch, we can do that, or we can even set the swatch to the color that we just picked, like so. The blending and the balance sliders stay the same across all three of these views. And if we want, we can simplify everything by pressing this accordion button. And we can also preview what it looks like without the effect by holding on to the little eye icon over here. In this instance, let's reduce the saturation of this and make it just a little bit more natural, while we introduce the next option, which is global. So global is at the end, and global actually sits on top of all of the rest of these options. So as you can see, we already have some level of shadows and highlights here to play with, but we can actually override all of these with the global option as well. So if we use the global option, we can see that the shadows still have a bluish tint to them. The highlights still have a pinkish purplish tint to them, but now everything on top has a yellow tinge to it. And sometimes this might be what you want, and sometimes it might not be, but it is a tool that you have at your disposal if you so wish. Coming back to here, and we'll just reset everything. One thing I wanted to illustrate is that if we go up here to saturation and we turn everything down so that we make the image a black and white image, what we can do is actually inject these colors into the image. Even though this was a black and white image, we can inject whichever colors we so desire. Because of this behavior, the color grading tool is an additive process. It adds color to your image rather than changing the values that were originally there. This is also the case with the global option as well, if we want to do that. Now, with all of that being said, color grading is such a powerful tool, but it requires a lot of restraint to use because it can be abused very quickly and things can become very amateurish very quickly as well. So make sure you're using this tool with some level of restraint. This tool also requires a lot of experimentation on your part as well. So I highly encourage that you get in there and spend a lot of time with color grading because it is one of those ways that can really help your images stand out from everyone else's. Alrighty, because we're on the topic of color, let's dive into what is, in my opinion, one of the most misunderstood, but one of the most powerful tools in Lightroom, and that is calibration. Now, please note that if you are using the cloud version of Lightroom, you won't find this in that piece of software, unfortunately. While Adobe has been pretty good with getting both of the apps up to feature parity, this is one of those features that hasn't made it to the cloud version of Lightroom just yet. So unfortunately, this will be a Lightroom Classic tutorial only. Now, before we dive into this tool actually requires a little bit of explanation as to how colors work in general when it comes to gear and the cameras that we use. Now, not all colors are equal. In fact, if you were to have two different cameras from two different manufacturers and you took exactly the same composition on both of these cameras, the colors of them would look different. And there's a reason for this. Every single pixel in an image contains a particular mix of red, green, and blue within that pixel to give it that color that you see in the final image. However, when you think about the color blue, what color do you actually think blue is? Is it more of a sky blue? Is it more of a ocean blue? Is it a tropical blue? Is it more teal or maybe more cobalt? There's so many different shades of the same color, but who gets to decide what exact shade it is when we talk about the color blue? Because when I say blue and think about blue, I assure you that it's a different exact shade to what you're thinking right now. And so every single camera manufacturer has to have an opinion on what the exact shade of blue is for their company. And they have to have an opinion of what every color is actually. And sometimes their opinions are not exactly true to life. But then again, true to life for one person might not be the same for another person, because we all see different shades of colors differently. And you can see where I'm going this. This is a hard thing to get right. Now, remember when I said every single pixel has some mix of red, green, and blue? Well, here is a color chart, red, green, and blue, and the associated chart with it. Now we can see exactly what we are doing when it comes to the calibration tool and whenever we make some changes. So, in terms of UI, let's see what's going on here. So we have shadow tint, which we will leave as an example until the end. We then have red primary, green primary, and blue primary. And as I mentioned, every single pixel, regardless of what color it ends up being, has some mix of red, green, and blue. And so with these tools, what we're able to do is redefine what those pixels are and what the mix of that is. So let's see this in action. If we take the red primary and we slide the slider towards the orange side, we see that the red circle is now orange. Conversely, if we take that same red circle and slide it to the other side, it is now magenta. And so if you were a keen observer, you may have noticed that when I was sliding these two back and forth, these were also changing at the same time, even though they were not red. Interesting, isn't it? So let's look at this again. If I slide this to the left and make it more magenta, you see what happens to the rest of the color wheel? Because every single color has some mix of red, green, and blue, or in this instance, red, every single color in the color wheel changes. Of course, the cooler colors, the bluer colors don't change as much. However, all of the warmer colors change substantially. And this is the case no matter which channel you go for. So if it's green and you move it over to yellow, again, we have a huge shift in the green and warmer colors. Move it to green, we have more of a shift in the cooler colors. Conversely, on the blue, if we shift it more towards the teal, we have a very big shift on this side and even a big shift on the warm side as well. We even have a shift to purple on the other side if we go down that route too. As I mentioned before, this is an opportunity for us to say, hey, blue actually looks more like this, or maybe it's a little bit more saturated. Red actually looks like this. It's a little bit more orange, and maybe that is a little bit more saturated too. And green could be more like yellow, and maybe that's less saturated across the board. And now we can start to define exactly what colors we want in our images. But the real power of this is that it extends way further than just what's in the calibration tool. Now, as an example, if we take this blue primary and we look at this very yellow color right here, and we move this over to the teal, we can see that this color now is turning a little bit more orange. If we go a little bit further and then up the saturation just a little bit more, look what we have. It's almost a mix between a yellow and an orange. But the powerful thing here is that if we go back up to our HSL slider, this is now defined as orange, where it was yellow previously, which is super powerful because now we can take this new orange and extend it even further to all the way almost to red. And that's really powerful because with the calibration tool, it is a global and lasting change as opposed to the HSL sliders. So let's reset the calibration tool just as an example. And let's again take this yellow, and again let's grab this picker and push it over this quadrant, and it gives us yellow. And then even if we were to change this value to orange, it is nowhere close to as red as it was when we changed it with calibration and then extended it in HSL. With calibration, you can do things to color that you can't do with HSL, and this gets really interesting. One common use for the calibration tool is to harmonize and unite colors. This for me personally is what I do. So with my particular color palette, and we'll break this down further in detail in upcoming modules, what I do is I actually do a mix of something that looks like this, whereby the majority of the colors are actually either a shade of blue and a shade of orange, so that we have these two contrasting colors against one another and start to harmonize the color palette that we're using. I actually personally take this a step further and I turn my greens less saturated and I try and push them into yellow like this, so that I have less colors available to me in the color wheel, and so from a aesthetic point of view it is more unique. Now, there are plenty of examples of this across the board, and we will definitely dive into more examples as we go into the workflow and end-to-end module sessions. Now, the last thing we'll cover here is shadows. And as I mentioned before, colors are an opinion of the camera manufacturer you shot your image on. And so there are cases where some manufacturers will have a certain color cast in their shadows. And in certain situations, this is what this tool was originally meant for. Actually, the entire calibration tool was strictly meant to calibrate the manufacturer's colors to something that is a little bit more normalized. But the shadow slider in particular is strictly for the occasions where the manufacturer has added some level of color cast, whether intentionally or by accident, to the shadows specifically. This does happen quite a bit. The effects panel is broken up into two main effects. We have post-crop vignetting first and grain. Since vignetting is at the top, let's start with that. Now, vignette is basically a lightening or darkening of the edges of a photo. All lenses come with some degree of vignette as a side effect of how the lens was manufactured. And sometimes this can actually be a desirable effect, but sometimes it can also be an undesirable effect. Most of the time, people will use the lens correction tool to remove the vignette and then use the post-crop vignette tool down here in order to put their own custom vignette on. And this allows for the maximum amount of flexibility. So going through the effect, we'll come back to style in a minute. Let's start with the amount. Now, sliding the amount to the left, we'll add a black vignette to the image like so, and sliding it to the right, we'll add a white vignette like so. Note that all the other options only become active once there is an amount given in the first slider here. So let's say it's 20, like that. The next option we have here is midpoint, and this determines how far or close from the edge of the crop you want your vignette to go. So if we hold Option on the Mac or Alt on Windows, what we can do is see a preview of exactly what is going to go on when we apply our vignette, like so. Roundness determines how flat or round the vignette will look. And again, moving it to the left will cause the vignette to conform to whatever the crop size is, and then moving it to the right will make the vignette more round. Feather determines how smooth the gradient is from effect to no effect. So after you've set your midpoint and your roundness, usually you will set your feather. And again, we can hold on to the Option or the Alt key, and we can see how much feather effect is being applied. Sliding this to the left is no feather, and sliding this to the right is a lot of feather. Okay, so now this next slider, the highlight slider, this works a little bit better if we set the image up a little bit nicer for this example, just so that I can show you exactly what's going on here. So if we crop in a little bit, and we just change a couple of the settings here to something like that, we can see that the highlights is currently at 0. So that means there is no highlight protection from the vignette effect. This slider determines how much highlight preservation is going to take effect against the post-crop vignetting. So if I slide this to the right here, we can see that some of these portions are lightening up. So if we compare nothing to 100, nothing to 100, you can see over here in the left, it's actually turning down the effect on the highlighted portion. This has an effect on some images more than others, especially if you have areas where Lightroom doesn't determine certain areas as highlights. There are several ways around this issue, like creating your own vignette with local adjustments, and we'll discover how to do that for ourselves in the local adjustments module. Okay, so let's come back to the style drop down here, and the next option we have here is color priority. Now, color priority doesn't always work the way you think it should work, and it doesn't always work very well, if I'm honest. But what the idea here is that Lightroom is trying to detect what areas are in the vignette area and do they have any color, and then it tries to preserve those colors. So before I select this for you guys, if you take a look at the general color of the sun here, we can see that there is a little bit of degradation in the overall color. It is a little bit darker on the edges than what it should be. So if we go to color priority, it changes only a little bit, not too much. It's very subtle. So for example, if you look at this area in the very bottom left here specifically, and the color that it is, and if we switch this back to highlight priority, we can see that there's a very subtle shift in the color gradations in that corner. Again, this effect isn't that pronounced, and Lightroom doesn't actually handle this that well, so this particular setting is not recommended for most occasions. The next one is paint overlay, and paint overlay overlays your vignette regardless of what is under it. It doesn't pay attention to highlight or color. So in this instance, it'll just cover every single thing, and you probably won't be able to see anything because the roundness is currently set to 100. But if we set this to a more normal kind of setting, we can see that there's a very strong kind of smooth vignette around the entire image. Okay, if we want to undo all of those effects, we can double click the post crop vignetting title, and there we go, back to normal. I'll also reset this image for us as well. So on to the next effect, grain. Now, grain can be occasionally difficult to preview depending on how many megapixels your image has or how far zoomed out you are, and also even what platform you're posting your images on and what resolution they're displaying at. So when you're using the grain tool, it is a good idea to zoom in and see exactly what is going on in your image. Now, for the sake of this image, let's zoom in to 100%. Just so that we can see what's going on. Now, again, we have the amount slider, and again, the size and the roughness and the options below will only be activated once there is an amount active. So as an example, let's set this to a high number so that we can see what is going on. And right now we can see that there's grain in almost every single area of the image right now. Now, size affects each dot of each particle of grain. So the default is 25, but dragging it down to 0 makes it super fine. So it kind of looks like this really scattered effect, almost looks like noise. And then if we drive this all the way up to 100, we can start to see that the grains are so large that it actually removes the sharpness from the image. So when you're using this particular slider, it's advised to use a little bit of restraint. Perhaps maybe like 45 or even 32 might be a good compromise. Now, lastly, we have roughness, and the default value is in the middle at 50 here, and sliding it right causes the grain to become more rough, almost as if Lightroom is applying sharpness to every single one of the particles of the grain. Sliding it to the left makes each piece of the grain less pronounced and less rough, and it even starts to make the grain look a little bit more like noise again as well. Now, depending on the look you're going for, it's highly recommended that, yes, you do zoom in to 100% if you can, but also zooming out so that you can see what it looks like when the image is full size and when the particles of grain are actually really small. Okay, the detail panel. So in the detail panel, we have a few things. At the very top here, we have the preview. This is useful for using the two options here, sharpening and noise reduction, because we're able to quickly zoom in and out of the image with a very small preview. So it's going to be a quick loading action every single time. If we press this little icon here, it resets the zoom to the original location, which is usually the middle of the image. And here we can see all the detail in this wonderful tower. The next option here we have is sharpening, and then below that, noise reduction of the luminance kind and noise reduction of the color kind. Let's start with sharpening first. So if you remember the presence lesson, sharpening controls the contrast for fine details or the high frequency, as well as the edges of details. So it adds contrast to the very fine details of the image, making it look sharper to our eyes, because remember, contrast is what makes things look sharp to us. The very first option we have is the amount, and the default here is 40. But if we have it at 0, then the other options become locked, as is the case with most other tools in Lightroom. The first control we have here is radius, and radius controls the thickness of how contrast is applied. For an exaggerated understanding of how this works, let's turn the sharpening all the way up to 100. Let's also zoom in a little bit deeper so that we can see a bigger screen here all the way. Having the radius slide towards the left or towards the 0.5 side decreases the size of the contrast down to 0.5 pixels per contrast line. Sliding it to the right towards the 3 side increases the size of the contrast to 3 pixels per contrast line. You want to be using this control and sliding it depending on how many fine details you have in your photo. So for example, with many fine details in your photo, typically a larger radius tends to make those finer details more obvious and the lines are thicker. So really it's up to you how you want to style your image. So as an example, if we leave this as the default as to 1, you can see how around the edges of these buildings, you can see all these very thick contrast lines here. And while we are zooming in, you can see them in great detail. When you zoom out, potentially they may or may not be as defined as you may like. So if we zoom back in and we turn this back up to, let's say, 2 pixels, so double the contrast line thickness, we can now see that there's a lot of contrast lines. If you look at the TOYO here, we can see that there has been a very thick line created for us, even around the buildings and those kind of lines. All of the harder lines here become way more contrasted, to the point where a lot of these details on the street become really muddy and really thick, almost even comic book looking. However, when we zoom out, that's what it's all about. If it looks good when it's zoomed out at the resolution and at the size that you are posting at, then it's okay. But let's zoom back in there for now to continue the example, and we'll reset this back to 1. So detail determines the amount of sharpening that Lightroom selects to sharpen. This isn't the same as the amount control. The detail control here defines what actually gets sharpened, what is eligible for sharpening under Lightroom's eyes. And then the amount gets to control how much of that is the case. So a value of 100 here sharpens even the smallest details, which can include noise in your image. So for example, in this sky right here, all of this stuff up here shouldn't be sharpened, and now it kind of looks like the image is getting noise sharpened for no reason. Zooming out of the image, of course, it's not as bad when we zoom out, but making sure that we have only as much sharpening as we need is the aim of the game here. So usually a value such as 40, 30, depending on your actual image, is usually fine. So the last option we have here is masking, and this is where the magic happens. Masking takes a combination of high contrast areas, defined lines, and a little bit of smarts and algorithmic magic in order to determine what Lightroom thinks are the most important areas in the image for you to sharpen. Let me show you. So if we slide the masking slider up to 100, you're probably not going to see anything at this level. But if we instead hold the Option or the Alt key, we can, as we are sliding it, see exactly what Lightroom is doing under the hood. And so the aim of the game here is that we want to have enough masking such that the main subjects in our image are sharpened, so all the white things, and the other things, such as the night sky in this case, to be black. And so something like this will work really well. Now, why is this important? Well, as I mentioned before, the sharpening controls the contrast of high frequency edge details. So unfortunately, camera noise being produced by high ISOs are also of the same frequency. So it's very common that we see that sharpening can also affect the noise of the image as well. So masking is important in that respect. All right, now the next tool we have is noise reduction, and we've switched examples here because this image is a low light image. This image was shot at ISO 3200. However, there is a +2 exposure on this. So this is more of the equivalent of shooting at ISO 12800. And in this image, without any noise reduction, from a zoomed out perspective, it's not too bad. That's because this is shot on a very, very high megapixel camera. And so if we zoom in, we can see that at 100%, there is quite a lot of noise going on here. There's both what's called luminance noise and color noise. And learning how to be able to spot the difference is a fairly useful skill in order to really get good at the noise reduction tool. So generally, luminance noise is all of the white little dots you have here. And color noise is very similar in look and detail and pattern, but it does have a color cast. In this particular image, it's actually quite difficult to spot because there's a lot of colors going on, but we'll go through the examples and I'll show you exactly what we mean. Now, let's start with luminance noise because this is the most common noise pattern. In this option, we have the amount, which is just the label of luminance. And so we can just turn this up and the rest of the options become available to us. And instantly we can see a huge difference on what is happening in the image in terms of noise reduction. And this is not bad. We can play around with this just a little bit more and see if we can get any more out of this. And it looks like we can just a little bit. Now, while we might be really happy with that noise reduction, the side effect of having so much noise reduction is that we inadvertently lose detail. And that's what this next slider is for. So sliding this slider to the right will increase the amount of detail back into the image. However, be careful not to go too far because you will introduce more noise back into the image. So for example, we're at 93 at the moment, but if I default this back to normal, we can see that all of this extra noise is now gone and then back again. And all of these little dots start to arrive again. So be careful with how much you use. If you slide this the other way, it does the inverse. It removes and smoothens out a lot of the details. You can see now her hair doesn't have any detail left, unfortunately. So let's move this up to here just a little bit. And the next option we have here is adjusting your contrast, because sometimes when you use a lot of noise reduction, contrast can also be lost as well. So contrast here in this context takes the noise reduction effects that have been added to the image and increases that contrast so that you can get some of that visible darks and brights back. Now, to show you the effects of the color noise, I've switched images here. So what we can see here is that when we zoom in, there's a whole bunch of this purpley greenish colored noise amongst this snow. Even down here where there is a actual green tinge, there is a whole bunch of purple tinge in the shadows, a little bit over here as well. And usually this is actually pretty difficult to spot. But in the case that you do spot it, let me give you an example. If we go back up to here in the top right corner and we crank color all the way up to 100, we can see that a lot of the purple noise is now gone. If we turn this off as an example, and then turn this back on, off, on, off, on, we can see that it has actually made a difference. Now keep in mind that the luminance noise, all the other white smaller noise and the fine detail of noise there is not removed at the same time, unfortunately. So we still would need to do our normal noise reduction on top of that color reduction. Now the color noise reduction still has a detail slider for if you need to add detail back into the image if it looks a little bit soft after you've done the color noise reduction. And instead of the contrast slider we have for luminance noise reduction, the color noise reduction has smoothness instead, which is a very subtle control that is used for lower frequency pixels or larger sized pixels so that the colors don't mush together as easily. It doesn't matter what lens you buy. Every single lens comes with its own set of quirks or visual characteristics that may or may not be desirable. Most commonly, what we're talking about here is three things: vignetting, distortion, and chromatic aberration. Every single lens has a certain amount of vignette, distortion, and chromatic aberration. And the great thing about Lightroom is that it has a very easy way to combat this. So here in the lens corrections panel right here, the most common action that we will do in this panel is simply this: enable profile corrections. If we select this, what happens is that Lightroom has a lot of different lens profiles for many different lenses of different makes and different models. Every single one of these profiles comes with a certain amount of distortion and vignetting that Lightroom thinks is the appropriate amount to basically restore the image and free it from the characteristics that the lens may have. Of that profile, if you aren't happy with the changes of distortion and vignetting that Lightroom has given you, then we can always change those settings here. With both the distortion and vignetting sliders here, if you have a profile selected, it will automatically be stuck at 100%. What we can do here is, if we don't like the effect that the profile has given us, we can actually slide the sliders down like this and remove the effect that that particular profile has given us. Or we can go the other way and increase the amount that the profile has given us to 200. If for any reason our profiles aren't there, which might be the case if your lens is super new or it's super old, either one, we can always go into the manual section here. Now the manual section is a great way for us to demonstrate exactly what's going on when we mean distortion and we mean vignetting. Let's start with distortion first. So distortion looks like this. If we slide this to the left, we can see that our image starts to barrel out quite substantially. If we reset that, if we slide it to the right, we can see that the image starts to pincushion quite substantially. Most of the time with lenses, it's not actually too bad when it comes to distortion, so most of the time we'll only need just a few degrees in order to correct whatever characteristics we have in that particular lens. One thing we can also do here is press this constrain crop button, and so instead of the image showing the white borders here, because the image comes in from the sides, if we select constrain crop, then that will automatically crop the image for us. Now back in our profile section, the second option we had here, if we reset this, was vignetting. And if we go back to the manual setting, we can see what vignette does. In this case, if we slide it to the left, it's very much like our post-crop vignetting that we have right here in the effects panel, except it's far more subtle than the post-crop vignette. As we can see, if this goes to -100, it only looks like this. There's not that much shadow detail in this slider, and that's because most lenses don't have that much vignetting that are baked into it. However, what we're looking at right now is the corrected version. So let's go back over to the profile and unselect profile corrections. Now we can see the toggle between what is going on when we select this profile. And if we wanted to mimic this in terms of vignette, what we can do is slide this to the right just a little bit, like so, maybe a little bit more of the midpoint as well. So much like the post-crop vignette, that determines how far in the vignette will go. And that looks good to me. Now, you might be wondering what this defringe setting is here. This setting is for the chromatic aberration. So what happens is that lenses, when they're shot against really difficult conditions such as this, where there are very bright portions of the image with backlit subjects, what we can see here is that all of the power lines across in a horizontal fashion are kind of purple. So in this particular lens, there is quite a bit of chromatic aberration. We can also see that there is a little bit of green as well, and that is also chromatic aberration as well. The objective here is to get rid of these colors and restore them to normal. And usually, if we enable our profile corrections again, sometimes, depending on the image, if we just select the remove chromatic aberration checkbox, sometimes Lightroom does a good job. In this instance, it didn't, so we'll have to get in there and do this manually, unfortunately. So that's where this option comes in. With this, we have a whole bunch of different options here. Essentially, we have two sliders here that pair together and two sliders here that pair together. So it is the amount of purple defringing that occurs in the image, and then what color that particular purple hue is, or it's green defringing and what color green fringe that is. What we can do is we can use the dropper tool, and we can select specifically what grade of color that particular fringe color is, just like this. And that will change all of the settings for us automatically and give us an amount as well. And as you can see, all of the horizontal fringing is now gone. And we can repeat this with the green fringing as well. So if we just select a color like, let's say this, we can see that Lightroom has given us the value of 3 and changed the hue color for us as well. Unfortunately, it hasn't done that great of a job with all of this minor detail here. And so we could probably just increase this just a little bit. And perhaps to my eye, maybe change the range just a slight bit as well. And that looks good to me. And so if we turn this setting off and turn it back on, we can see the little detail changes that have been made here, and all of these power lines are now suddenly cleared up, ready for us to edit. Okay, so transforms. This is an often forgotten about but very important tool in Lightroom. The transform tool is used to correct distortions and level out our images. And before we dive into the Lightroom tool, it's worth understanding how these distortions are created in real life so that we could then learn how to mitigate their effects or be able to spot them so that we can fix them in post. So over here, I have a camera. And this kind of only works if I show you directly facing the camera. But basically, when you're shooting a subject, if you are either horizontally or vertically off center of that subject, you will cause what's called perspective distortion. So obviously, if you are shooting this way and panning a subject and you have the pan just a little bit off from the actual plane of the subject itself, then it will cause a horizontal distortion. And then if you're shooting, let's say, a building or a lookup or something that's higher than you, and you are shooting vertically, then that will cause a vertical perspective distortion. So those are the two things to look out for, panning and tilting. And this occurs all the time whenever we're shooting. Most of the time, we're going to be just a few degrees off on the horizontal axis or on the vertical axis. And most of the time, it doesn't actually really matter that much. But when it does, especially in cases where you're shooting buildings or objects that are taller than you, then it's unavoidable. And that's where the transform tool comes into play. Okay, so in the transform panel, we have a whole bunch of different options here. The very first one is our upright options. And here we have a collection of 6 buttons that enable Lightroom to automatically make adjustments for us. So we obviously have off, which is the default position, but level is the first one we will dive into now. So if you look at this horizontal line at the very top of the building here, level is literally just leveling out your image for what Lightroom thinks the level should be. So if we press this, we can see it just barely adjusted what was there before. If we go back, forth, that's kind of what it looks like. Now, vertical does the y-axis correction. So this is vertical perspective distortion correction. And this is the one that you'll be using quite often if you don't want to do this process manually and you find yourself shooting a lot of buildings like this where this kind of distortion is inescapable. For reference, let's press it and see what it does. And now we can see that the lines are very straight. And this is ideally what you want when you're shooting a building, because buildings are supposed to be straight. And this tool helps us automatically vertically align that. The next two options we have here are auto and full. Now, both of these options give you both perspective and leveling automatically, but the auto option, like this, gives you a little bit more crop area to work with and less true corrections. You can see that the lines aren't perfectly straight, but it does give us more of this crop area back. Whereas the full option here will give us absolute correct lines, so leveling and straight lines here, but at the cost of some of the image's real estate. This is especially important when we are cropping into the image like this. So if we press that constrain crop button, it automatically crops the image for us. Now we need to work out if this crop is good enough for us to continue the edit with. Okay, so the last button we have here is guided. And guided allows us to manually draw in the lines and then have Lightroom automatically do it for us. So for example, if we select this portion here and we click and drag to a portion of the building that is supposed to be straight. Notice that I haven't let go of the mouse yet, but the actual line itself is not fully straight. So we're pretty much drawing over the part that should be straight. We let go, and then we need to draw another line that should be straight as well. And usually this will be the opposite side of the building that we are trying to go for. So something like this. And we can see that Lightroom has automatically tried to correct that for us. Sometimes the guided version works really well. Sometimes it doesn't. It is really up to you to experiment with all of these different methods and see if Lightroom gets it right. And then if it doesn't, we can always do it manually with these options here in the transform section. Okay, and these are the manual controls for the transforms. So vertical is probably the one that you're going to be using the most often. And most of the time, you'll be using it to the left, kind of like this. And this might be okay for you. If we go the other way as well, we can obviously see that it was the wrong direction. The next one is horizontal. This is very useful for if you accidentally shoot something off axis in a hurry and you're not exactly parallel to the subject. So sliding it to the left tilts the image to the left like so, and sliding it to the right tilts the image to the right like so. Most of the time, you're not going to have such an extreme change. Most of the time, it's just going to be couple of degrees. In this instance, it's just 2 degrees to the left for me and my eyes. Although this is out of scope for a Lightroom course, what you'll find with enough practice is that if you practice shooting dead on horizontally with your subjects, over time, you'll get better and better and better at it so that you won't need the horizontal adjustment in the transform tool as much. However, this is not the case with the vertical perspective distortion, unfortunately. You can't actually get away from vertical perspective distortion unless you're using a specialty lens like a tilt shift lens. Okay, so the next option is rotate, and this is exactly what it sounds like. Sliding it to the left rotates the image from a central axis to the left, and sliding it to the right rotates it from a central axis to the right. Sometimes this is useful if you want to make changes to the rotation without affecting the crop rotation. The next option is aspect, and this controls the ratio of the image. Sliding it to the left causes the aspect ratio to widen, so things become fatter. And sliding it to the right makes the aspect ratio taller, so things become narrower. This is especially useful with the vertical slider because sometimes when you're using this slider, the actual size of your subject changes, and so your aspect ratio can be a good way to compensate for that change. The scale option here increases or decreases the size and the exact settings that you have with the rest of the transform manual controls. X offset moves your image left or moves your image right off the canvas, and Y offset does exactly the same thing as well, with left going down and right going up. Of course, before we had the constrain crop checkbox ticked, and as soon as we move some of these sliders beyond the canvas area like so and let go, it automatically snaps to where it can crop in canvas.